All right, thank you everyone for coming. Appreciate your being here. And the topic of my speech is going to be the art of reading Scripture spiritually. And reading Scripture and studying Scripture in general has been a passion of mine ever since college. And I just took a bunch of Bible classes, made it into a major because I just was so interested in it. Learned exegesis for the first time, how to read Scripture with a historical context and literary context, and just learned a whole bunch of things for the first time. I just really was fascinated with it, the world of Scripture, and kind of just opened my eyes to see Scripture differently. And I noticed I wasn't the only one, too. I would see a bunch of students that were really fascinated, researching, finding out all they can about Scripture, reading commentaries and going to classes and just getting everything they can, soaking it up from the professor. And I noticed that every good professor would, like the first day of class, let's say like 1 Corinthians or Isaiah or something like that, they would kind of cast a vision and capture the hearts of all the students. And, the students would be like really into it. They'd see an example of Scripture being used really well and kind of get all the meaning and the juice out of Scripture, the profound truth. And I just fell in love with it. And I continue that here in seminary as well. But I noticed that once a lot of students learn exegesis, I kind of discovered that they were telling me that they had problems reading Scripture devotionally. And I didn't really understand this, wasn't expecting this. I was surprised by it because exegesis should be a great tool. It should be helpful in kind of deepening our life with Christ, but it instead proved to be a hindrance. And so I was wondering, what's going on here? What is contributing to this problem? And so I researched it, found this topic, and I found that it's a much bigger problem than I thought. There's not necessarily anything wrong with exegesis itself. It's how we approach Scripture and use Scripture for our own benefit instead of coming to Scripture on its own terms. And so the first problem I discovered was that we come to Scripture on our own terms for our own needs, wants, feelings, and we do that in three specific ways. First is the intellectual benefit, trying to learn as much information, data as we can. These things aren't necessarily bad in and of themselves, okay? The second thing is for a practical benefit. How do we live? And so we try to go to Scripture and try to get morals. We try to get wisdom. How do we live successfully? There's also the inspirational benefit of going to Scripture, looking for passages tailor-made for your circumstance or how you're feeling, what you're looking for. Like let's say you're looking for comfort or encouragement or a challenge. And so you go to Scripture and you kind of pick and choose what passages you want for that kind of need that you have. So that's one problem that we have of approaching Scripture in a wrong manner. There's also a second problem, is that we fail to recognize or appreciate the form that Scripture is given to us, and that is story. Scripture isn't just a textbook or an encyclopedia that we kind of look up passages and find it helpful or useful for whatever circumstance we may need it for. Scripture is made up of stories. And even beyond little stories, there's also the meta-stories. So each passage, each chapter, each section, each book is part of this larger, grand story, God's story, which is given to us in Scripture. And it's a wonderful thing that it's given in story because story is arguably the most accessible form of communication. It's also the most personal, revealing, engaging, inviting form of communication. And so it's a gift that Scripture is given to us in this format. And so what is the solution for this problem? I think it's not necessarily a matter of 12 steps or 7 steps or how we read it with some kind of strategy, but it's a different approach, a whole different approach is needed. And I think there's this metaphor that I found in Eugene Peterson's book that I really like, and he uses this metaphor of eating Scripture. Eat this book. And I think that's a very helpful metaphor because when you eat something, you're tasting it in your mouth, you're digesting it, and it becomes part of you. It enters your bloodstream, and it provides nutrition for your whole being, and it becomes part of you. You internalize it, you assimilate it. And that's what we do, that's what we need to do with Scripture. It's not just engaging our brain, our mind, but we bring our whole being into Scripture, our whole lives, our whole experience into Scripture, and we allow it to become part of ourselves. So it's not just about what can I learn or what information can I gather, it's about who I can become. It's about formation rather than information. And he gets this analogy, this metaphor, from Revelation 10:1-11, which is a pretty strange section of Scripture, in which an angel appears to John, and he's proclaiming the message of God, and John is trying to record it, And the angel says, no, stop, put the pen down, and just listen. Eat this scroll, eat this book, the angel says. And so John eats it, and it tastes sweet in the beginning, and then it gives him a little indigestion later on. And so it's a good metaphor for reading the Scripture. It's something that we eat, and it might not always be comfortable, like it gives you indigestion sometimes. It calls for a change sometimes, and sometimes it appears strange to us, even that particular passage. But it's what we need to become human beings, to learn who we are as people made in the image of God. And also, another solution is participatory reading. It's not just about reading, to gather insights or observations, or to use that information in certain ways, but it's about active personal engagement with Scripture. Reading it with the eye towards obedience, and also towards adoration. I heard from Paul Ricoeur that he suggests a hermeneutic of adoration in contrast to just a hermeneutic of suspicion. In biblical studies, we're taught that we need to be suspicious and critical as we can, throwing away things that are not historical, things that are not things that have some kind of agenda behind them, and just trying to get the little meats of truth that may be there. But in addition to that, perhaps it's helpful to use a hermeneutic of adoration. That's a more positive way of approaching Scripture, of how we can apply it to our lives and how we can worship God as a result. And of course, we need prayer. This is not something that we do just by ourselves. We need the Spirit's help. We need the community of believers to help us in this as well. So it's not about getting God in our lives. That's the whole wrong approach. It's about meeting God as He reveals Himself, and allowing Scripture to draw us in to that participation with God on His terms. If you notice, I started this speech with a story. I showed you how my passion for biblical studies has influenced this whole thing, and how Scripture is itself a story, a meta story, and so that is a gift in and of itself. We think of Jesus Christ as the most pivotal gift that God has given us. But also Scripture is an amazing gift, because in story, God has revealed Himself. He's laid it all out there. And it's up to us now to respond and to appreciate the gift of Scripture for what it is. So the invitation has been given. It's up to us now to respond.